Oh,
Cool. All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me. And thanks for coming and listening. So I'm Yang. I'm basically, I'm an engineer working on a small project called Plasmic. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So yeah, I'm excited to share a little bit about this because it's something that actually started for me a while back as a passion project. And it's just a tool that I hope can be useful to React developers, but also interesting to learn about and talk about as a React project in itself. It's certainly been a bottomless well of challenges, both technical and otherwise. So yeah, I'll start with a quick high-level overview of what is Plasmic. So it's basically a new visual UI builder for React, and we basically wanted to solve two different problems with it. So we've worked on product teams for a long time, building a lot of different React applications and front ends generally. Working with designers, and from what I've seen on product teams today, collaboration between design and engineering can be complex and time consuming. So actually, I wanted to first take a step back. I'm just curious how, I don't know if there's a way to poll people in Zoom, but maybe just like send a chat. How many of you work with designers?
so yeah, there is a little reactions if you want to give like a thumbs up or a clap. We only have two options in Zoom. Sweet. Are you seeing all that, Yang?
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. All right, so maybe like half. Cool. Yeah, that's it's actually around the percentage that I usually get, and so designers, they spend a lot of time creating these very high fidelity vector drawings, and they hand these off to engineers, and engineers have to recreate these from scratch, by hand using code. Inevitably, there's a lot of things that can get missed in this translation, because it turns out that we as developers really suck at this translation or catching all the details. And it's also sometimes just hard to translate because designs are like completely freeform drawings, right? And you can do anything you want. And so this leads to a lot of back and forth with design. And ultimately, you have these two sources of truth on the product teams that are never truly in sync. And so I really wanted to see if there was a way to streamline that using better tooling to collaborate better and smooth that translation process. So that was the first thing. But the second reason why I was working on this was because I just wanted a better and kind of rethought development experience for people like myself who are crafting these UIs. And the idea is really so I can build a lot faster and at the same time eliminate an entire class of visual bugs and QA and related tooling, and just get a very fast feedback loop from my authoring experience. So GUI builders are actually, they're not a new category. They're actually very widely used. They've generated perfectly fine code that ships into all sorts of major apps for a long time. Very successful on other platforms like iOS and Android and Windows, where there's kind of this clear company owning the platform. And so I wanted to try bringing some of that to the web as well. So yeah, that's kind of what Plasmic is a visual UI builder to let developers or designers, either one, really craft complex presentational components that actually plug into your code base. So it is the real thing that you ship with. And the idea is to let you move faster and fix that collaboration process. So anyway, that's a very long-winded intro to what this is and why it is. But I'm gonna give a quick demo of this. Let's see. Can you all see my screen? All right. So I already talked about this. These are the two reasons for working on this. All right, and so this is the tool itself. I'm going to go through this demo of building a simple to-do MVC project. So in case you're not familiar, to-do MVC is everyone's favorite sort of starter example app that there exists a bunch of reference implementations for. So this is roughly what it looks like. I'm not going to rebuild this whole thing. I'm just going to build a very small subset of it. just to give you a sense of how this tool works. So basically, you start off with this sort of blank canvas that you can kind of freeform. We give you a bunch of like freeform drawing and styling tools available. So you can kind of start with a very rough idea of what you want your UI to look like, and then from there refine it into something that's real, that's robust for production, et cetera, has real layout and whatnot. So I'm going to set this viewport size to be mobile-ish, and I can just start slapping things onto the screen. I can type some text like for the to-dos title. I'm just going to enter that text there. I'm going to make it huge and make it thin and give it this sort of very light red here. Put it up there, and right below it, I'm going to start drawing out my first sort of task card. I'm just going to draw this box here and resize it a little bit. I'm actually going to make the background of the whole page this sort of off-white, warm gray, like so, maybe a little bit warmer. And so this is kind of the flow that I wanted to enable with this, is basically giving you this really fast feedback loop so that you can iterate just directly in the authoring tool. Sometimes, I find myself, working a lot in Chrome developer tools for this kind of stuff, and then like copying values back and forth between there and my original source files, and just wanted to streamline that a lot. And also, I'm going to set this background here for the card itself to be pure white. And in here, I'm just going to draw this round sort of circular checkbox. And I'm going to give it a very light border, clear out the background. And next to it, I'll just add some text for the actual task itself. So buy some milk. I'll make this maybe a little bit larger and give it a lighter gray color, like so. I'm going to save this gray color actually as a reusable design token called text color. So there's a bunch of these abstractions that we have in the tool for letting you achieve greater consistency throughout your designs and also just move faster. So this is this is one example of this, is color tokens. So I have this basic sort of look and feel that I'm just kind of like, sloppily drawing out. And then from here, I want to keep refining it into something more and more real. So as an example, in my actual to-do app, I don't just want one of these tasks, I want a whole bunch of them. So what I can do is I can right click this task, I can create a component out of it, I'll call it task. And now I can just like copy this and paste it a bunch of times to get like something that is, roughly vertically arranged like so. And then, but I actually want them to be really vertically arranged in using real layout and whatnot. So what I can do is I can lasso these into a vertical stack. Whoops. Like so. So these vertical stacks, they basically, they're similar to Flexbox. So they expose, all the usual kind of controls that you might want out of something like Flexbox, but we try to really streamline and make it, a lot more intuitive than figuring out, your flex spaces, trying to remember align versus justify, that kind of thing, and also just giving you that fast, immediate feedback. So, if I, for instance, I'm going to remove the background here. I'm going to snap everything to the top, to the left. I can double click and edge to auto size the content vertically. Maybe I'll do the same thing horizontally. So these are some simple examples of the layout features. I'll show some more interesting examples that go beyond what you get with Flexbox and CSS in a little bit. But I'm going to call this element task list. Naming elements is useful for just keeping your UI organized, but also it'll come in handy later for the actual code generation part. So this is the list of tasks, and these are all saying the same thing. That's kind of boring. And actually, in the real product, I want these to be different, right? And in fact, I want it to be variable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this component by double-clicking into it. So any changes I make to a component are going to be reflected to all the different components. And basically, for now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to select this text, and I'm going to expose it as what's called a slot. So I'm going to convert this to a slot. And basically, what slots are is it's just, you can think of it as like the children prop in React. So that means from outside of this component, from any instance of it, you can select that slot. You can, fill it with arbitrary content. it's like poking a hole in this component and letting you fill it up with anything you want. So something I can do is just double click this to change the text. So I can call this make to-do app, show a demo. These are some simple examples of this, but you can actually fill this up with arbitrary number of elements, anything else you want. So this is, so I have these tasks, and the last thing I want to do with the task component is I wanted to design it out in its various states. So this is a very common task in building UIs, right? You want to reflect lots of different possibilities for what your component can look like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first right-click this component to pop it out into its own artboard. So I'm editing it in isolation. So this is similar to like the storybook experience if you have used that. But basically for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, I'm going to design out these different states. And the way we kind of represent that is using this concept of variance. So what that means is I can create basically these different states for this this task. Like maybe I want to design what it looks like when it is marked completed, what it looks like when it's being edited, what it looks like when it's marked high priority. Accidentally insert an extra one here. So you can create all these different states and then just design what they look like by selecting one and then directly making changes. And all the changes that you make will record as overrides that are specific to that state. So just to show you an example of this, I'm not going to design all these states. I'll just show the completed state. But for the completed state, I want this check box to have a check mark in it. So for that, I'm going to actually just screen grab this. I like this check mark from the actual reference app. So I'm just going to, whoops, if I can screen grab that. I'm going to copy that and paste it in here. I'll kind of zoom in for a pixel grid, resize it a little bit, center it, and then zoom back out. So this is what my completed task looks like. And I can switch between my base appearance and my completed appearance to kind of see the difference, or I can actually just double click, or sorry, right click this artboard and duplicate it. So these artboards are basically just different views of the component. You can create as many views as you want, arrange them however you want. And I'm going to set the second view to be looking at the base appearance and the first view to be looking at the completed appearance. So I can compare them side by side. So with variants, you can actually override anything on any element in the component. So maybe for the completed task, I also want the text itself to be strike out and maybe made a little bit dimmer, like so. Oh, that's weird. I don't know why it made the try that one more time. Oh, I think there's maybe a bug here where when I try editing this text color, it's actually affecting the original look and feel. But anyway, so you should be able to style your elements differently, including the color. And then you can kind of see the difference side by side in these different artboards. So that's kind of the idea that we want to drive with this, is enabling you to craft things really quickly, have instant visual feedback for things that are inherently visual like this. And the thing about these variants is that you can actually, because they're just recording overrides specific to specific variants. So all this variant, this completed variant is doing is remembering that when the task is completed, I want to show a check mark and I want to strike out the text. Those are the only differences that it records. So you can combine a bunch of these variants together in the same way that you would think about CSS classes being dynamically enabled on an element, for instance. So for instance, if I also wanted to design out like a hover state for this task, like whenever I hover over any part of the task, I want the circle to be darker. I can do that by, I can create another variant here, an interaction variant called hover. This is just a special type of variant that we have support for because they're, CSS pseudo classes. And then in here, I can select anything like this circle, and I can just make it darker. Hopefully this works. Yeah. Okay. And so now if I can actually test this out in this sort of live preview mode. I can switch to live preview and just play with that. okay, so this is kind of the effect I want, but I notice another thing that I want is I want the cursor to be a hand pointer as well. So I'm going to select this thing and just set it to a hand pointer, like so, and try it out again. Okay, that's better. That's kind of more the effect I want. So the thing about these variants is that they come with the component. They're part of the component anywhere it goes. So back in my main screen, where I had these 3 instances of the task component, I can select any one of these. Like maybe I'll choose this middle one. I'll set it to completed just for as part of my mock. And also, if I switch into live mode, I can play with everything. You know, this is a little bit subtle, but you can see we're dynamically combining the completed state with the hover state in this middle instance here. So anyway, that was pretty much it for just building this to-do app, you know, in this flow. And down here, I'm gonna actually just tidy this up one last bit by giving it some real layout, centering, and maybe adding a bit of padding on the top and bottom. And so yeah, that's pretty much it for this to-do MVC. And so from here, this gets into like the real interesting part, which is actually working with this from a code perspective. So how do you do that? So there's a few ways to get started with that. Basically, we have this partnership with Code Sandbox where we integrate into, you know, Code Sandbox, if you're not familiar, it's basically just like an in-browser sort of playground for trying out React code or you know, any framework really. And so you can quickly just, you know, create a sandbox and see, you know, exactly what you created in the Code Sandbox. And it basically gives you, you know, something very similar to the live preview mode where you can kind of cycle through your different components that you created. Like here's a task component. I actually forgot to create a component out of this main screen. I'll call it to-do app. And you can actually regenerate, you know, these sandboxes and see them. So anyway, this is one way you can get started with playing with the code. So you have, you know, what you created actually running, you know, as a sort of pixel perfect translation of the original asset. Besides, you know, Code Sandbox, you know, you really want to get this into your own sort of code base. So I'm going to show how you can do that here. Basically, we provide you with a CLI that you just run from your own sort of React code base. It can be some existing React code base. So I have here actually this simple to-do MVC. Let's see, I'm going to clean this out. Okay, so I have this blank React app, and just to show you it running, this is what a blank create React app looks like. There's nothing really in it, but you know, you can do this with any sort of arbitrary React code base. So first thing you do is install this client, which I already have, and then you run Plasmic in it. So I copied that, I'm gonna run it here. It just has like 3 simple questions that you kind of, I'm just gonna answer defaults to. And it's adding a very small runtime. And then finally, I'm just gonna copy this command to actually sync down the components from this project. And what this does is it puts everything in this source components directory by default. So if I look now, you know, source components it's created. Plasmic JSON is basically tracking a bunch of metadata and configuration for what we want. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. But the first thing I'll do is I'm going to pull up my code editor. And this is the editor on the right, and then the running app on the left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace all this boilerplate in the create React app, the spinning logo and whatnot, with the with just rendering the to-do app that we just created. I'm just going to get it onto the screen like so, and that should do it. So yeah, that's really all it takes to get this into a code base. Now from there, you know, what you really want to do is hook this up to real data, right? Real props, event handlers, data, etc., your actual state. And so the way that works is I'm going to click into this to-do app to kind of look at what's inside. And so this is one of the multiple codegen schemes that we support. So this is called the presentational library scheme. So what this means is we give you these presentational components. These are pure presentational components, like this Plasmic to-do app component here. And the to-do app component around it, this wrapper, is just a thin sort of stub that we generate for you. This whole file is actually owned by you as a developer. You can do whatever you want with it. You can delete it. We don't really care. What we do manage and generate for you are the presentational components. So this is a done presentational component that just like renders stuff on the screen. And you can basically hook this up to all the props and overrides and whatnot that you actually care about. So to show you an example of that, let's say I want to render the to-do app, but with all the tasks actually replaced with real data, stuff driven by some state. Maybe I'll just say my data comes from some simple React state. So I'm going to define some React state for my tasks. State. And let's say I have this kind of format for what my tasks look like. I just have a name property. So do stuff, do more stuff, do even more stuff, do even more stuff, bang, bang, bang. And then, so these are my 4 tasks. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace that task list, which, we named from before. And so I can reference it easily. And then I can say, I want to replace its children with just, rendering these tasks. And I can actually render them using the other component that we synced down from the project. So the task, like so. And so, yeah, now I have my tasks actually rendered in the running app. So, so this is, the scheme, like one of the schemes that we support. So it's, fairly straightforward. You should have these presentation components that you can wire up however you want. And the whole thing that we're trying to enable with this, the main challenge for us was figuring out, okay, how do we not make this just like a one-time thing where, after you hook up, after you go and add your, props and whatnot, you're completely disconnected from the designs forever, right? How do we enable you to iterate on the design? Because that's how real products work. And so going back to the design tool, like let's say I wanted to violently change the layout of this thing. So instead of these vertical lists, I actually wanted to change this to be like a tile-based layout. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click into this task. I'm going to resize it to be more of a tile shape. I'm going to turn on auto layout, and I'm going to actually add some padding here, maybe 8 pixels of padding. And I'm going to take this check mark. I'm going to pop it out of its place so it's free floating, and then I'm going to move it down to the bottom right of the task, and I'll anchor it to the right and to the bottom. And so that's what my new task looks like. I also want this thing to actually be arranged as tiles, more like row by row. So I'm going to select this whole container of these tasks, and I'm going to set it to be row-based layout. And now it's spilling over the side, but I can actually turn on wrapping. So I have things actually wrapping around. This is a little closer, but I noticed, I can't really see the difference between the different tasks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some gap. So I'm going to add some in the vertical direction and also the horizontal direction. So anyway, these are some of the slightly fancier features of like the layout engine that we try to give you and try to, this is an example of how we try to make layout a little bit more intuitive and streamlined. So, things like FlexGap are long time wish list items for us. And it'll still be a while till they're universally supported in all browsers. So we kind of implemented our own polyfill for this kind of stuff. That's one example. So anyway, so now that I've been making these changes, I can actually run Plasmic Sync again, but actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to run Plasmic Watch. And what this does is it will continuously sync down the latest changes from the source. So if I just go back to my thing, you can see, the running app has the latest layout. But if I actually set these side by side, you can see I'm actually, as I make changes, like if I, increase the row gap or the column gap or any of these things, and I resize, everything is kind of getting streamed into my actual React application. So this is another kind of workflow that we wanted to enable. Anyway, so that's kind of all I wanted to show for the actual tool itself and how this authoring experience works and what we wanted to enable with that. But I want to spend like the remainder of the time kind of talking about, I think, the more interesting bits from the perspective, like, the challenges in building something like this and what we kind of focused on for code integration. By the way, I don't know if there are questions so far, but feel free to just like, I guess shout at me with questions, with anything.
Not a question, but awesome job. I mean, out of the gate, thinking about the visual kind of presentational components, separation and stuff like that, which you're completely correct, is exactly where those tools start to get difficult to use longer term. That's awesome. I noticed you're using TypeScript and stuff like that as well. Are you like, do you have some ways to try to keep the developer from shooting themselves in the foot with the presentational kind of separation and stuff like that?
Yeah, so good question. The presentational components that we generate, they do, we've actually spent a lot of time wrangling types in TypeScript to kind of give you a nicer experience after this. So this interface is somewhat flexible. Like, for instance, this is kind of what I started with, but right out the gate, you can get like an autocomplete of all the elements inside of that component. So you can just, fill your way directly through this without pulling anything else. And in here, all the props that we give you are inferred from the type of the, the elements. So, if you want like on click, these are all kind of auto-completed as well from that. Or, if this was not just a div, but actually another like component type or something like that, you would get the corresponding props for that as well. Let's see. So, so that's kind of some of the ergonomics that we here. And same thing with, the task itself, the task component, that's another one of these generated components. You can see it has a children prop that we can pass in. And that was because we defined this. We want to give you complete ownership of the prop interface for these components, right? You should be able to define exactly what parameters you want these components to take. And so that is something that, you can blow away these props and actually add your own data types and whatnot. So that's another thing that we enable here.
Yeah, it's
so,
pretty cool. It's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks for the kind words. So I'm going to switch back to my presentation here. Oops. All right. So technical challenges. There were a lot, but I think the main ones that I would highlight in building something like this was one, there was a lot of pain around like the getting the state management infrastructure in place. So this is mainly for latency and scalability concerns. So by latency, I just mean like, you have a lot of operations like drag operations where you want things to be smooth and you don't have a lot of budget to work with, especially if you account for like the reflows that you're triggering as a result of like, if you, resize some div, like that's actually triggering a lot of layout reflows, right? So you have these, ideally 16 millisecond, 16 millisecond budgets that you are constantly busting all the time. And so basically just how do we minimize that as much as possible? The other aspect of this is scalability. And what I mean by that is, in this canvas, this is very simple. I only have 3 artboards here, but if you have like, thousands of artboards or, some huge number, like how do you make sure that the app is responsive even in light of that? And so, this just results in a lot of work breaking up work for React, breaking up things so that they're more incremental, and you're making more incremental updates lazily as needed, and whenever you have idleness in CPU idleness available. So yeah, that's kind of just a bunch of work for making that happen. The other aspect of this is dynamic module loading. So this is for live preview. I kind of mentioned, when you switch in a live preview mode, these are actually the, this is actually using the real generated code that you would get from, running the CodeGen CLI tools. So it's not like cheating or taking any shortcuts. This is the real thing. And so in order to do that, we have to like dynamically transpile and load these modules in the runtime into the canvas. same thing, we have a similar set of challenges for accommodating code components. So being able to bring in your existing component libraries, like if you're using Material UI or your own component library or something like that, being able to work with that and compose those together into new screens in the design tool is also like the reason why we have to accommodate sort of arbitrary third-party code in here. Yeah. So there's also like other challenges there with respect to isolating the domains, the origins of your, making sure like your UI is running in a separate origin from like the rest of the actual Plasmic itself. Some of the product challenges we had in this, one was just distilling layout into a small set of intuitive controls. This is actually surprisingly hard. Just because there's so many ways to like cut yourself using CSS that like basically our approach is we still give you full access to be able to do anything you want, but 90% of the time you just want things to be like to wrap or to stretch or to something more intuitive like that, right? And like for instance, if you wanted two divs, two text divs to horizontally stretch to fill the available space given to them, you might try something like setting flex to 1 and just running with that. But you may or may not be surprised at the result of that. Like there's always an explanation, right? Like in this case, like flex is a flex row multiplies the flex basis, and for flex direction row, flex basis defaults to the width of the element, and width defaults to auto, which in this case means the maximum content size. So you're content sized by the text itself. So that those things will grow at different speeds depending on like the actual text that's in them. So this might even be something that only noticed later on in production or something like that. This thing I ran into recently. So anyway, there's always an explanation for these things. You can always figure it out, but like it's just you probably have better things to do with your time. So basically, getting this is one example, but also like getting things to align with baseline, your icons and your text, or like due to a combination of like legacy and modern layouts. Like by that I mean like non-flex and flex layouts, etc. When really all you want is for things to like either stretch to fill the parent or like to wrap their content, like most of the time, right? So yeah, those are some of the layout intuition challenges. And then another one was mapping concepts from other design tools into our own. So this is for import features. So we have the ability for you to import designs from other tools like Figma and Sketch. And for that, these design tools, they're great vector drawing tools, very freeform. They're all about like, they're basically operate in this SVG world, which is very different from the HTML, CSS, DOM world. And so when you have things like layer masks and centered borders and these like certain funky gradients, these are things that are actually a lot trickier for you to translate in higher fidelity, right? But anyway, and even for the things that are straightforward, it's just like a bunch of grunge work. So yeah, I think mapping that impedance mismatch and trying to make that as high fidelity as possible was another big time sink for us. And lastly was just designing the core representation for how to express all these different abstractions that you want real UIs to express, like components existing in different states, having the ability for extracting like common bundles of styles as like mix-ins, things like that. These are all things that yeah, just took time for us to get right. But I think like the hardest challenge, the most core challenge was really around the code integration piece. And I kind of showed you a little bit of that already, but the goal for us was really about like if you think about what's natural for visual direct manipulation and what's natural for expressing in code, we wanted to marry the best of both worlds and give you as flexible an interface for working with the code. Right? We want to take away the burden of keeping the code in sync with the design, but at the same time, we want to give you the complete freedom to build and structure the code components as you see fit. Right? This is both for practical reasons, like you ultimately need to instrument behaviors and props on different elements, but also for aesthetic reasons, right? Like you just want a certain API for your component. Like you don't want it to take children or whatever, you know, you want it to be derived from the like task objects or something like that. So our thinking is basically always rooted in giving developers as much flexibility as possible so that the code gen is only there to help and not to hinder. And so we have these two kind of code gen schemes. One is called this black box library or presentational library scheme, and the other is the direct edit scheme. So I've showed you the presentational scheme already a little bit, but basically this one is all about just giving you a bunch of presentational components. Usually, you know, you don't need to think about you know, what's in these or anything. You just work with them, you render them and instantiate them in your wrapper components, your real code components. And you know, you can override props on any elements, you can render it in any of the variants that you've defined. You can render any chunk of these components selectively. And for the actual developer-owned components, so this is like the to-do app component that wraps the Plasmic to-do app component earlier that I was showing. You know, here, this is entirely owned by you, so you can like change up the prop interface however you want. You can add whatever state and logic behavior that you want. You can switch it from a functional to a class component. You know, you can not render the Plasmic presentational component at all. Doesn't really matter to us. Like you can do whatever you want there. So that's kind of it. For this presentational library scheme, this is like the clean line that separates the two worlds, if that makes sense. Let me know if this is, if I'm making sense with any of this. Cool. And then the other scheme we have is actually quite different. This is called the direct edit scheme. And the whole idea here is, this is actually pretty fun. We actually generate you a regular JSX tree. So we don't generate you a separate presentational component that you pull in as a library. And you actually can edit any part of the tree directly, you know, using your code editor. You can add props to elements, add or remove elements, or, you know, replace them or wrap them in other elements. You can wrap things in expressions like IIFEs or, you know, loops or things like that. And the idea is really that, I mean, both schemes are similarly expressive, and it really just comes down to your preference on which style you prefer. And you can mix and match both in the same code base. So I guess maybe this is easier to show by example, but so I have these, you know, this to-do app. So far, these are the presentational library scheme that I've shown. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this over to the direct edit scheme. So I'm going to change up this configuration here so that it's generating direct edit. And I will sync again, but blowing away my current components. So now if I look at the to-do app component, remember before we were rendering that Plasmic to-do app presentational component. Now, instead, we're just rendering this sort of transparent, you know, JSX tree that you can directly work with. So what I mean by that is, let's say I'm going to put this code editor on the right, and then the UI builder on the left, and I'm also going to turn on Plasmic Watch, so you can see the edits being streamed into my code editor. But let's say, you know, I don't know, like I want to wrap the title here, this to-do's title, in another element or div or something like that, and just wrap it around. And I'm also gonna, I don't know, add an on-click handler to the title as well, and maybe I'll, you know, add some other stuff to the end of this. So this is, I'm just making a bunch of edits directly to this file, right? Now, if I make some more changes to the actual, you know, design itself or anything, like these are continually being merged in. And so we're just like continually, you can think of it as a rebase. Like we're continually rebasing your developer edits that you've made to the file on top of the latest presentational changes. And we do this because in the same way that, you know, a Git rebase would work, we basically have the ancestry information about the lineage of this code. And so we can do this three-way diff and but do something smarter than a line-based rebase, which is what you get out of Git, right? Because we actually have awareness of JSX syntax and things like that. So yeah, anyway, that is a high-level overview of how this this scheme works. So it's a very different type of scheme, but yeah. Anyway, so that's pretty much it in terms of like the main challenges that we had in building this. And we're still iterating on this. It's still really early days for us, and we're trying to get it right. But yeah, so I think I'm just gonna zoom past this. The only thing I'll say in terms of the impact that we've seen so far is that it definitely encourages you to think first a little more thoroughly about what it is you're building, rather than just like diving into the code. Like actually being able to feel out the what kind of UI or what kind of product experience you're going for, and refine it from there, and then graduate into the code is actually really helpful for making sure that you're building the right thing. And then all the logic and actually data plumbing and all of that, the code itself is it just feels more efficient because it's all purely in service of that one direction. And the other thing I would call out is when so far I think this has been mostly used by developers for building these front ends, but for our team, we've been able to get our designer into the tool, and that's, I think, really it does feel magical when you just like run. I was working on our landing page recently. Like, I just run Plasmic Sync over and over, and each time I run Plasmic Sync, there's like a nicer version of landing page that just like ends up on in our Gatsby code base. So that's kind of like the I think yeah, it does feel magical. These are some things that folks are building. I think that this is the main thing that makes this project the most fun for me to work on, is just seeing what people are creating with it, and yeah, and Plasmic itself is also large parts of it are built in Plasmic as well. Yeah, and that was pretty much it. So I'd love to take questions if there are any, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you. That's awesome. I think I talked over somebody else who was going to ask a question last time, so I'm going to shut my mouth for a couple seconds. Give somebody else a shot. That's awesome though, Yang. Thank you very much. That's really cool.
Thank you.
Hey, my name's Cam. Can you see me?
Yeah. Hi, Cam.
Cool. I worked on a very similar product in the fall called Lanai, lanai.io, but I was targeting React Native. So I know how much work this is. I just want to say
what was it? How do you spell it? Sorry.
Lanai, like the Hawaiian island, LANAI. I think our technical approaches are very similar, and I just want to say I understand it's a lot of work, and you guys have done a great job. So good work.
Thank you.
I'm curious how you are planning to differentiate yourself from existing tools like DraftBit, or there's a few of them now, but especially with as a React engineer too, the first thing I noticed when I saw the export code was a little bit of vendor lock-in, and so you addressed that with the second export option, which I think is cool. I wonder if you're spreading yourself a little bit thin, or if you have like more of a targeted approach here.
Yeah, great questions. So I'll kind of address the first part of that, which is the landscape. Yeah, there's actually a lot of these emerging tools, which actually has been really exciting for me personally, just because I think that this is a very nascent space, very young, and I feel like this actually all this activity really helps in bolstering like this as a direction, and adding legitimacy for this category of tooling. But I think the main difference is for us is that we're really focused on product teams, development teams. So There are a lot of great tools like DraftBit, et cetera, Bubble, and there's these categories of end-to-end app builders that are all about like, you know, really eliminating a lot of like the logic and that kind of code as well. But that hasn't really been our focus. So for us, this was a tool for ourselves as developers, and we wanted to have something that was more open world, that, you know, it doesn't dictate what, you know, your data store or, you know, state management or anything else is, your routing framework, whatever it is. Like you still are owning all that, and, you know, you probably, your existing code bases already have something. And for us, we're just focused purely on the visual aspect of things and the presentational aspect of things. Yeah, I think that kind of flexibility was what we were really wanting and missing from the current set of tools.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, and so yeah, because of that, because we're able to focus on just that set of problems, that has been, I guess, what enabled us to go deeper on these code gen schemes and really try and get them right. So yeah, I think the vendor lock-in is definitely like one thing that, you know, we as developers ourselves would definitely be concerned about. So that's why, one of the reasons why we pursued the direct edit scheme. But even for the presentational scheme, we actually have a way for you to eject from that. So like, let's say, you know, you've been using the presentational components for a while, you want to get out of the system altogether and just have plain React code. You can actually convert that into plain React code as well, and just, you know, run with it. So you're never kind of like locked in because of a choice you made earlier.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you for answering my question.
Yeah.
I got one. I gave my 10 second, so I waited. Everybody had their chance. The layouts that you're doing today, so you kind of have like an abstraction layer over top of like the CSS that gets output and stuff. Are you using Flexbox or CSS Grid or kind of both-ish, or do you have like I didn't look deep at the kind of like the different options and stuff inside the application, but just trying to get an understanding of like. So I guess the thing that immediately hit my head was that I have some clients who also don't understand what it takes. Like they need their own playground a little bit sometimes to figure out answers to why some of their ideas might not be good or why some others might be better or whatever. And so like,
Yeah.
being like, I've used Storybook and stuff before to try and bridge that gap, but there's a lot of prep that you have to do to make sure that you're giving them the right knobs to play with. And then, you know, at the end of the day, we ended up just kind of scrapping it because it started to drift so far from where, you know, some of those conversations started in one of the projects. They're just intrigued by kind of like when they do things, what is the impact or the constraints that maybe could exist in the system and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I said a whole bunch.
No worries. So the layout, yeah, this is basically, just think of it as Flexbox. It is Flexbox, but with, you know, anytime you basically think about anytime you use those like hacks in CSS, like, you know, the you know, the plus operator for adding gaps into things, right? Like these are all things that we wanted to bake in as first class into these controls. So that's so yeah, I mean, we're still using Flex, but just with, you know, these specific techniques for doing gaps properly, right? Like for instance, you know, when you have gaps and you have wrapping, you don't want the column gap to be coming after this one and this one, right? Like this one is at the edge here, right? And so, you know, silly things like that actually just take up a lot of time to get right. And similarly, you know, if you have these things have their own margins as well, and you want to like increase, you know, tweak specific margins on specific items within these gaps flex boxes. How do you make sure you're doing that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For For like trying to make something that works with different screen sizes and stuff like that, is the approach right now to kind of work with within variants?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep,
That's
and then
right.
you kind of toggle between. Cool. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So responsive designs, like let's say, this is a, let's say this was my mobile design, or sorry, my desktop design. And let's say I wanted to also design what this looks like for mobile screen sizes. So I'm going to actually duplicate this and move it over here to the left. And I'm going to set it to be smaller. And so for this, so I have this, mobile and desktop side by side. For the mobile, maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variant. I'm going to actually create, we have this special category of variants called screen variants, and you can just create one called mobile. And maybe this triggers at maximum 400 pixels. And basically for this, I want to make some adjustments. Like I want this text to be not so huge. I want it to be a lot smaller. And whoops, that's way too small. Maybe I want to decrease the padding of the whole thing from 64 to like 16 pixels. And I want to change the layout of this thing from row to column, and also kind of tighten it and center it. So these are, some of the things that you can tweak right in between these different, I guess, the desktop and mobile variants of this thing. So it's still based on the same premise of just using variants and the same primitive, but extended to this particular context reuse of it. Same thing with variants. And generally, you can like hide elements altogether. Like if I didn't want that, you can do that as well. So yeah, that's how you would just specify overrides for different responsive screen sizes. And this, just FYI, all these things that require CSS pseudo classes, like these media queries for responsive screen sizes, or like hover states for the components. When the changes are limited to things that are purely style differences, we do compile that down into CSS, pure CSS, pseudo classes or media queries. But if you do things like hide the, like if you are conditionally rendering things altogether.
No. Yang, we lost your whatever device you had attached for audio. I'm going to guess that yep, you're coming back in right now. Oh, you're good. You're muted right now, but welcome back.
Oh. Cool. Sorry about that. That was weird. Anyway, so this is yeah, I was just saying that if you venture beyond styles, then we compile down into actual React logic for managing the conditional rendering things.
Very sweet, Dan. I hope you're seeing too. A couple people had to bounce out, but they're giving you some high fives and stuff like that in the Zoom chat. So just wanted
Sweet.
you to know that those were there.
Thanks. I actually can't see anything in the Zoom chat. I don't know why. I only see a blank box.
Oh, I can take a screenshot if you want, but everybody is saying great presentation, excellent work. So.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Is there any problem with when I share kind of the recording and stuff like that, or any kind of additional information, any URLs that need to be, like, is everything okay to talk about and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, we haven't really like publicized anything, but yeah, we have no qualms about just like putting stuff out there.
Awesome. Very cool. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Nope, that was awesome. I really enjoyed your presentation. It's cool to see what you're able to do. Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing, honestly, for someone who's never used anything like this.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, definitely. I think the main thing we're trying to learn right now and get feedback on is like this tool. How does it actually feel to use, and like what are blockers for people in terms of being able to be productive with something like this. So, yeah, definitely welcome any and all feedback. I'd love to hear.
How have you guys handled like security considerations just because you are generating code?
Yeah, so I think from a security standpoint, like the code that we actually produce from scratch is purely this presentational code that is like, you know, ultimately it just, you know, comes down to this type of thing, like divs and whatnot, and a bunch of CSS that you don't see here. The actual CSS I can show you. This is like, you know, stuff that we're trying to let you not worry about. But basically, this is the extent of the code. And so because we don't really focus on the logic or the state or, you know, behavior of things, that really minimizes our surface area. And, you know, that for all that, you know, it's still, you're still writing code yourself to make things actually happen with your data store, your, you know, your infrastructure, et cetera.
Cool. Thank you. It's really awesome.
Sweet. Any other questions?
Cool. Well, again, thank you. Turn my video on. Let's see if my kids scream in the background. Thank you again, Yang, very much for first of all, for reaching out and offering to do a talk. That's great. Secondly, the content was really good. And there's a ton of technical depth and stuff in there as well. So that, like, hats off to you and your team. This is great. Did you, I don't think you even mentioned a whole bunch. Is it just you? Do you have a team? Is it like what's kind of going on with Plasmic?
Oh yeah. We have a small, wonderful team. Yeah, they're amazing. And yeah, so we've just been working on this as a team for, you know, close to a year now, basically on this.
Well, it's really cool. It's really cool stuff. I can only imagine some of those technical hurdles that you had to overcome. So that's really cool stuff. So thank you for Yang very much for attending tonight. I will, like I said, once I get a recording, I'll run everything past you, make sure everything looks good and stuff like that. And thank you everybody for joining tonight. And if anybody else has any topics or any things they want to bring up, just a kind of a peek behind the curtain. Dan and I have been talking about redoing the website at some point, and we're trying to find ways to turn that into a team activity. So we might even do potentially some prototyping in Plasmic or something. Might be kind of fun.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'd be happy to like dive into that too.
I think that would be a really neat way to tie some of this stuff together, especially because Dan's out because his knee's all busted up right now. This is really cool. Excellent job. Thank you very much. It's really neat.
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity to share this.
Excellent. Well, everybody have a great evening. And Dan's usually on top of remembering what we have coming up. We might have something coming up. I forget what it is if we do. Everybody have a great evening, and I'll talk to y'all later.
Thanks, Yang. Have a good night.
Yeah,
Take care.
Thank you very much.